Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Meena Bose. I'm the Executive Dean for Public Policy Programs in the Peter S. Kalikow School of Government, Public Policy, and International Affairs, and I'm also the Director of the Peter S. Kalikow Center for the Study of the American Presidency. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here today to join us for a discussion of a panel co-sponsored with the National Center for Suburban Studies at Hofstra University, The Uncertain Suburbs, Trump, Congress, and Swing Voters. In the past 15 months, we have held many sessions, I see several familiar faces, to talk about presidential leadership, policymaking, advising. Today, we're actually going to take a different perspective. We'll be looking at Washington governance from the perspective of what the voters think, particularly suburban swing voters, and what the implications might be for the elections in November and also for governance in the coming months. So there are many topics in the news, but we'll try to stay on focus because we have some breaking news here of our own, of a new poll. I'm going to let my colleagues share the specifics on that. Let me just quickly thank our classes who've taken the time to join us, Professor Bengal's writing class, Professor Labenberg's rhetoric class, my presidency students, and everyone, all the students from other classes. I know Professor Sims and Professor Burnett's classes here. We regret that the snow days kept some classes from being able to join us, but we're delighted that so many of you have taken the time to be with us today, and we look forward to a most informative discussion. Our speakers today will include our Kalikow Center Senior Presidential Fellows, Howard Dean and Ed Rollins. Governor Dean is, of course, a former Democratic National Committee Chairman, presidential candidate, six-term governor of Vermont, and practicing physician. He transitioned from practicing medicine to elected office in Vermont in 1982, and then went on to an extensive distinguished career in public service, including serving as governor for 12 years. And then in 2003, running for president, when he implemented what were at the time innovative fundraising strategies through using the internet. As chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Governor Dean created and implemented the 50-state strategy and the development of 21st century campaign tools, and he's credited with helping the Democrats make historic gains in 2006 and 2008. Maybe you'll give us some tips on what will work this year, what will work in 2018, Howard. Governor Dean also dedicated resources to revitalizing the party infrastructure, technological capabilities, and organizational tools. He has been a fellow with the Kalikow Center since 2009. Mr. Ed Rollins is one of the leading political strategists and communications experts in the United States. He managed President Ronald Reagan's 49-state landslide re-election victory in the Electoral College in 1984, and has had major managerial roles in nearly a dozen other presidential campaigns. Mr. Rollins has served in four White Houses: Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush, including 2 tours of duty as assistant to the president, the highest staff appointment in the White House. In the Reagan administration, Mr. Rollins directed the White House offices of political affairs and intergovernmental affairs. He was also deputy chief of staff during President Reagan's second term. He's currently a Fox News commentator, provides political analysis for has provided analysis for many other networks, was inducted into the American Association of Political Consultants Hall of Fame, and it has been a senior fellow at the Kalikow Center since 2009. Mr. Rollins and I are teaching the American Presidency together this semester, and as he told me when we were working on the preparations in January, we have to rewrite the syllabus. So we'll be sharing some of those insights today. I'm delighted that my Hofstra colleague, Larry Levy, the Executive Dean of the National Center for Suburban Studies at Hofstra University, is participating on the panel today. Larry Levy, before coming to Hofstra, spent 35 years as a reporter, editorial writer, columnist, and PBS talk show host. He won many of journalism's top awards, including Pulitzer finalist for in-depth works on suburban politics, education, taxation, housing, and other key issues. In his leadership at the National Center for Suburban Studies, he works closely with our academic director, Professor Chris Neat, whom I'll introduce in a moment, to give it a truly national profile. He has been a guest contributor to CNN.com, the NewYorkTimes.com, covering previous presidential elections, and writes a regular column on politics for the Albany Times-Union. We're delighted that you're here today, Larry. Also, let me say my co-moderator, Chris Nee, is the academic director of the National Center for Suburban Studies and a professor in Hofstra of Applied Social Research in the Department of Sociology. He earned his PhD in geography at the University of California, Berkeley, and has expertise in labor, housing policy, and has conducted research in many areas of social policy, including the living age, gentrification, and the politics of class, race, and geographic inequality in older suburban communities. I'll also introduce, though he chose not to sit on the stage with us today, my colleague in political science, Professor Craig Burnett. Professor Burnett comes to us from California, got his PhD from the University of California, San Diego, an expert in state and local government, urban politics, political behavior, electoral institutions, and research methods, and has published numerous articles in journals such as Political Communication, Electoral Studies, the Urban Affairs Review, and the Minnesota Law Review. So we're delighted to have so many experts here today. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Neat to tell us a little bit more about the new information from the Center for Suburban Studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meena. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to sit on this distinguished panel, and also I'm very excited to present the results, most recent results of the National Suburban Poll. This is a poll that we've been running now for 10 years. This is the 10th wave of the poll. We usually field it either once a year or once every 2 years, focusing on election years. When we first started the poll, we were very interested in the transformation of the suburbs, the way the suburbs were changing. And a lot of our work at the center both considers how suburbs are evolving in terms of their demographic composition, and also how they're changing in terms of the attitudes and lifestyles of the people who live within the suburbs. And this poll has given us a terrific window, not just into kind of the year-to-year topical, kind of hot-button political issues, some of which we're going to be discussing today, but also into kind of the more profound and long-lasting changes that are making changing the suburbs generation to generation. Just a little bit more background. Every time we do this poll, we usually survey about 1,000 suburbanites. It's a national poll. We do it across the country. And then we also take smaller samples of urban and rural populations. And you'll see the results when Professor Burnett presents them for all three of those groups, urban, suburban, and rural as well. Historically, we have, the poll has been done as a phone sample. In recent years, we've been transitioning to doing online surveying, and we found that, at least so far, the results that we've been getting seem to be sort of in line with what we found when we were doing the phone polling. We also have worked with other scholars in past waves, both to develop the questions, and then other academics have analyzed the resulting data. And so every time we do the poll, we produce a report, keep an eye peeled for that in the next few weeks, where we'll give the complete top lines. Today's presentation is really just the highlights from our first look at the data, the first cut. So without any further ado, I will introduce my colleague, Professor Burnett, who will tell us some of the most exciting and interesting findings from this year's National Suburban Poll.
Sure if we can get the screen on. I don't want to start talking like I do in some of my classes and they go, what are you talking about? And I go, oh yeah. So if we could, I don't know what the...
I think it's coming on in just
Okay, I was going to say, I don't know the secret code here.
I should have said light, sorry.
But this is, I'll just start by giving a little bit of context to the poll and kind of highlighting what are some of the challenges of doing research in public opinion today. And it's, I would say we're at a point in public opinion research where I don't think it's ever been harder. Ever since the advent of sort of modern public opinion research, really with the Gallup organization 50, 60 years ago, I don't know that we've ever had such a hard time getting a sense of what the population actually looks like. And as a result, this means that when you're trying to do things like projecting what the outcomes are going to be, it's extremely difficult. And so I present these results with that note of caution that they are instructive, but not necessarily determinative. And to that end, there's, I think, an even more difficult part of public opinion research where we have all sort of started to shift into the online format because, well, as you probably know, I could ask the group here, how many of you guys have a landline? So a decent amount, and I'll notice that most of those people were not students here in the audience today. And that's and that certainly tends to be true. That as people stop having landlines, it gets even more and more difficult. And so as we go to an all cell phone world, this is only going to compound the problem. And as you probably figured out, most people nowadays don't even really want to answer the phone as it is. Now, with that being said, I'll jump right in so we can get right into the more interesting stuff here, and that. We'll start by looking at sort of where is Donald Trump and how is he doing, and here it's not looking great if you're thinking about re-election in 2020. Of course, we're several years out from that, but he's not doing particularly well in the suburbs, right? He is. The reports have been, and certainly our data seem to confirm that he is not very popular. He's actually more popular in urban areas. And keep in mind, this is a national sample here, so we're not just sampling places like New York, we're sampling places like Indianapolis, where he does much better than he would in a place like New York. And his base seems to like him just fine still, where he's getting 51% support in the rural areas, and that tends to be where he does the best. Now, of course, approval of the president is one thing, and that's certainly tied to the upcoming election. We're going to see in many ways that the 2018 congressional elections will be a referendum on probably a couple of things. One, it's always the economy, and the second will be how the president is doing. And congressional elections tell us, especially these off-year, these midterm elections, that it's usually the people who are most upset that end up turning out the most. And so we ran a question on the generic ballot, right? Whether or not you intend to vote for the Republican candidate or the Democratic candidate. And so this is a national poll, right? So we can't specify which candidate is actually running in their district, so we just ask them a generic question. And this is stripped down to just a two-party vote, so this excludes people who say they don't know or they don't plan to vote in the election. And you can see that in the suburban sample, it's actually about a plus 19 or so for the Democrats, which should be very alarming if you're a Republican candidate. In the urban, it's actually slightly higher. It's 68.8 versus 39.2. In the rural, it's basically 50-50, right? So Republicans are actually doing fine there. But if you look at the overall, you're again back to about a plus 15 or so. So this is certainly hinting at the possibility that this would be something of a Democratic wave that's forming. And we've certainly seen elections so far corroborate what we are seeing here. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, this would probably be the signature program for the Trump administration thus far. And how is it doing in the relative areas? It's actually not necessarily doing great in the suburbs. Only 32.6% of people actually think it's been a good thing. In the urban areas, it's actually done a little better, 36%. In the rural areas, it's only 25.8, but that actually exceeds the disagree portion of the sample. And you'll note here that, like almost every policy question out there, a lot of people don't really have a good handle on what's going on. They sort of know what it is, but they don't necessarily know how to feel about it. And certainly in terms of the policy we're talking about here, it may be too soon to tell. Right? People don't necessarily have the frame of reference yet to be able to render a verdict. But almost all policy questions draw a lot of the percentage of unsure. For the SALT limitations, so state and local taxes, this was a key component of the law. We were interested in particular because it has, generally speaking, an outsized effect on the suburbs. And we found that on this particular policy that was included in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it is pretty much unpopular everywhere, but it's extremely unpopular in the suburbs, with 41.6% disagreeing with its inclusion. That being the quantity of interest for us anyway. Urban is much more mixed, rural, again, mixed, higher percentages of unknowns here, because again, this is now getting to more of the specifics of a policy for which most voters don't necessarily understand the ins and outs to be able to render a decision. For DACA, this is the policy that would potentially allow undocumented childhood arrivals to have a pathway to citizenship. And this will break it out by strongly opposed is in the blue, opposed is in the orange, favor is in the gray bar, and then the yellow bar would be strongly favor. And this bears out that it's actually pretty popular just about everywhere, even in the rural districts. And so this would lend some credence to the idea that should be popular support to get something done. But it's extremely popular in the urban core, and then still very popular in the suburban areas too, a little bit more mixed in the rural, but still exceeding 60% in terms of some sort of favorability. Support for building a border wall. Again, one of those signature programs that the president has run on. Generally speaking, this follows the same. Blue is strongly favor, orange is favor, gray is opposed, and yellow being strongly opposed. You can see that in the suburbs, strongly opposed, the modal category is the modal category with 38.1%. Almost reaching 60% total with opposition. In the urban part of the country, it's a little bit more mixed. There's a little bit more favorability there. In rural, it actually is a popular idea at 56% and some sort of favoring of the building of a border wall. Relationship with Russia, another potential issue in the upcoming election, something that's certainly been ongoing in the news. How well has this entered into the minds of most voters? Well, for a lot of people, they view Donald Trump's relationship with Russia as something of too friendly. 46% in the suburbs, 27% saying not too friendly, 27% not having a strong opinion about it. In the urban core, it's almost 50% think that it's too friendly, 22% think it's not too friendly, 28% unsure. 38% in the rural think it's too friendly, again actually being the modal category here. But a lot more people expressing an unsure or not too friendly opinion in the rural districts. Climate change. And this question was asking individuals whether or not they think that climate change will have a direct impact within their own lifetime. So not in some 50 or 100 year time frame, but sometime we presume in the next 20 years or so. In the suburbs, it's 34% no, 44% yes. Being, again, the modal category. In the urban core, it ends up being a lot higher. 57.2% believe that it'll happen sometime in their lifetime. In the rural districts, it's about the same as the suburbs, although slightly less in terms of people believing that climate change will impact them personally. And with that, I turn it back over to the moderators. And thank you for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you, Professor Burnett. I have to say, this is really getting information in real time. It was less than 12 hours ago, I believe, Professor
Right.
Neat, that we confirmed that we would be able to discuss these survey results, and it meant some restructuring of our panel and some late night review by all of us, but I'm just so delighted that we have a chance to talk about this poll because, frankly, the results were very surprising. But I will defer to my colleagues. I think Professor Neat, you wanted to say something, and then Larry Levy about the poll,
Yeah.
and then we'll turn to Governor Dean and Mr. Rollins.
I'll just try to put this into some broader perspective. And excuse my voice, I have these awful allergies, which I'm sure half of you are sharing. These numbers are devastating for the Republican Party if they are, in fact, accurate. And why is that? Because the suburbs are the swing vote. Since perhaps the election of the second election of the first, the election of the first Bush, the suburbs have provided the decisive vote, not only for the presidency, but for control of Congress. And coming up in 2018, virtually all of the roughly 40 competitive districts are either entirely or substantially in suburban communities. So a generic gap between Republican and Democrat of 20 points in the suburbs where these districts are is a real problem for the Republican Party. Again, we're months out, but as things stand now. And on some of the main issues, climate change, DACA, guns, these are the hot button issues that are likely to drive the debate in these elections. And again, they're all trending toward Democrats in the suburbs. So I just put that into a broader perspective.
Okay. Thank you, Larry. Chris, did you want to offer your assessment of the poll results? Or
I guess I would just echo what Dean Levy said. I think that these, given the importance of the suburban vote within national elections, many of these results are troubling for the Republican Party. I would also just add that we have also started to break out within the data. We identified swing and competitive congressional districts, ones that were competitive and ones that were not. And again, what we're seeing in some of those competitive districts is, at least when we look at approval numbers for the president, that swing districts, the approval numbers are 2 points lower. So again, concerning.
Okay. Let me start with a question then for Governor Dean and Mr. Rollins and Mr. Levy about the poll results and what they mean for policymaking. I was very surprised to look at the approval ratings. We know, especially because there have been stories in the news about President Trump's approval ratings are about where they were at the 100-day mark, which would be, end of April. So we're nearing that point now. Still a majority disapproval rating. But nevertheless, given the many events in the news, the special counsel investigation, the scandal allegations, the attorney issues, I could go on, there have been, the approval ratings are holding steady and actually have gone up a little bit. But when we look at the Suburban Studies poll, President Trump's approval rating is actually higher in urban areas. It's actually 47.6% and about 10 points lower in the suburbs. Governor Dean, Mr. Rollins, Howard, Ned, do you want to start with this? What explains this? Why are the suburbs so much more dissatisfied with the president than the urban areas?
Well, I think we have to ask the pollsters and the analysts this question. I also have another question while we're piling on you guys. So one of the interesting things about this, what's happening here is, of course, this is all about turnout. You can have polls that look like this and still lose if our people don't turn out. And you said this favors the Democrats. I actually disagree. Because what I think is happening, and I'll let Ed speak to his own party, although I have plenty of opinions about it, I actually believe that both parties are undergoing an enormous change. And the people that are fueling these kinds of numbers are actually not Democrats. They're young people. And young people don't really care about institutions. They don't think they need institutions. It just happens that their values are the same, more or less, as the Democratic Party. They have a huge value for climate change, as do we. They like diversity. They like immigration. They believe that gay rights is a civil rights issue of their time. As you saw in the Starbucks incident over the weekend, there were a whole lot of young white kids saying, what the hell do these people do? How could you do this? I mean, so the country is changing dramatically. And the younger generation is fueling this, and the intensity is fueling this. When we had that huge win in Virginia, 15 new seats, those 15 people looked like what the Democratic Party looks like in the future. They don't look like me. There were 2 African Americans. There was the first Latina. There was a transgender person, a gay person, a Muslim. These are all members of the legislature now in Virginia. So the reason I bring this up is I would have liked to see some numbers about age in this poll. And I don't think the Democrats can take anything for granted. I think we happen to be on the cusp now because young people values and our values are the same. But if we continue to do what we did for the last couple of years, which is sort of not figure out whether we're kind of like the Republicans and diddled around in Washington with the same old, I don't think we can take a lot for granted here. And I'd just be fascinated to hear, A, about ages, which I know you didn't put the analysis in, and B, sample, I have a feeling, has something to do with this urban, suburban stuff, and I would love some thoughts about this.
Well, I would say we're only beginning to analyze the data, and I mean one of the next steps is going to be breaking it down by both the gender and age and race, obviously. I will say that the urban suburban split might be explained in some small way by kind of the inclusion of, like, when. Again, we're just starting to drill down, but it seems as though some of the urban sample that comes from smaller cities, kind of, smaller cities in areas that some people might consider more rural, not like larger metropolises, might be kind of bringing up some of the numbers, for instance, for the Trump approval. Did you want to? You want to say
No, I'm fine. Normally, we would not have released a poll at this early stage, but we had this event, and we did have confidence in the top line numbers, so we released them. But we're going to have everything that your heart desires in the next couple of weeks.
So this really is breaking news here today.
Yeah, it is. It's the top lines.
Ed, it's okay.
The suburbs have been the most critical element in elections really since World War II. They really a majority of voters. For a long period of time, they were the Republican base, the strength of our party. It certainly isn't today. Democrats under Clinton started to make some inroads into those communities. And if you really look at how Trump won by about 75,000 votes. The 3 states that he carried, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. If you'd have had some just slight change in those 3 major suburbs of Milwaukee, Philadelphia, and Detroit, he probably would have ended up being a loser. We have several things that are happening in American politics today. Neither party has a plurality of voters, the plurality are independents. I think in presidential politics in the foreseeable future, you're not going to see anybody get a majority because you've got a bunch of other candidates who run, and there's anywhere from 5 to 10% of voters who don't vote for one of the 2 main party candidates. And as an analyst today, not as a defender of the indefensible, which I have to do most days, today I get to put my academic hat on. I get to relax and basically try and, as I always say about President Trump, I had very low expectations and he hasn't met them yet. But his base is still there. His 40% plus is still there. And are they intense? And are they? And I think the one thing that people totally underestimate, he now owns the Republican Party. It's not Paul Ryan's party anymore. It's not Mitch McConnell's party anymore. It's his party, and whether people like that or not, it's a reality, and it will be for the foreseeable future. I don't know whether he runs for re-election. I don't know if he survives all the stuff that he's going through today, but he certainly acts like he is, and I think to a certain extent, if you want to analyze this last election, he had an enormous rural vote, something like 63%, which was a gigantic vote. The suburbs, he did better than Hillary did. Hillary did not run. One of the great strengths of his candidacy was that he had a weak opponent who ran very much behind the Obama juggernaut, or either Kerry or other candidates. So I think the reality here is, and one of the things that we have to look at in 2018 and 2020 in the congressional races and the legislature races is the big issue we've had that's been dominant for us has been the reapportionment that took place after 2010. They gave us, for all practical purposes, an ability to get a majority of the Congress. If we lose that majority in this cycle, if we lose some of those legislative seats, and you've got one more cycle of the 220 before the next census, you could easily have the lines drawn again to where it becomes more of a competitive environment, and Republicans will have to struggle to be a majority party or even a competitive party. I think the key thing is there's a grouping that's kind of an urban suburban. There's 109 of these places across the country. Reagan carried 92 of these, 106 I think. Trump carried 82 of them. So the reality is, Trump lost 82 of them. The reality is Trump picked and chose rural here, there, whatever, and it was like drawing to an inside straight. You could not have, if I sat down as a strategist who's basically been doing analysis for a long time and campaigns for a long time, the only way he could get to where he got was by getting those states. You had to have Pennsylvania. If you don't have Pennsylvania, you're not going to win. Wisconsin, which obviously you've had, I could not understand why Hillary did not go to Wisconsin when you have a governor who's won 3 out of 3 elections there and a national chairman who was from Wisconsin. For some reason, you'd think he'd go base.
House Speaker.
And a House Speaker, excuse me. And in Michigan, which obviously used to be a swing state, when Debbie Dingell, whose husband represented the district for 52 years, and she now represents Detroit, she keeps saying, you've got to come here, we're in trouble, we're in trouble, we're in trouble, and they didn't go there. So I think to a certain extent, and those are all very small margins. I mean, Pennsylvania was the bigger one. So you add that with what's happening in Florida with the Puerto Rican population. Many Puerto Ricans, over 300,000, have already moved from Puerto Rico into the Tampa area. And the estimates is that there may be 1 million Puerto Ricans who basically think that life in Puerto Rico is never going to be quite the same, and they're going to move to Florida. When Trump won Florida by 104,000 votes, that can change the dynamic really dramatically. So I think what we're seeing here is a trend, and I don't think either party knows who they are anymore. I think the reality is you want young people, we want young people. You're going to get young people if they turn out to vote. We're going to get older people who do turn out to vote. But the reality is that both parties are trying to redefine themselves, and who are we? We were the fiscal party, we were the law and order party, we were all the great elements above and beyond, who just passed a budget that basically will add $1 trillion every year. We passed a tax bill that basically is going to stick it to the suburbs of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, California, elsewhere. So I think the reality is in the next 4 years, we're going to see a dynamic change in American politics. Young people are going to make a dramatic difference. Women voters who historically are a majority of the population will continue to be a majority of the population. And I think a lot of these suburb numbers, if you break it down, are really women that are moving away. And I think to a certain extent, we've got a real battle, and it's something going to be fascinating to watch. And in 4 years, I hope I'm still here to analyze, but I can't predict other than the trends. The trends are not Republican or Democrat. The trends today are a lot of unhappy voters on all parties, and they're waiting for someone to come in, some leader to come in and step up and carry the ball forward. I think for young people, the solution is going to be who's going to be fiscally conservative, who's going to basically, as you all get out into the world and have college debts and the ability to get jobs or the inability to get jobs, whatever the case may be, you're going to want some fiscal responsibility. Obviously, the more elderly, my group, we still care about the social issues, Social Security, Medicare, what have you. We're going to stay around longer and need more, and that's going to be a bigger and bigger burden on the populace. So I think the reality is this is a very interesting study, and I think to a certain extent the suburbs are always going to be the target.
Even as the suburbs have become more competitive from the days when it was the Republican bastion, as Ed said, they've also become more complicated. A perfect example is Long Island. Now, if you live on Long Island, your vote doesn't count in presidential elections, unfortunately. But you're a great guinea pig because you are one of the quintessential swing regions in the country. Nassau County, for instance, wealthier, slightly better educated, closer to an urban area, voted for Hillary Clinton by 6 or 7 points. Suffolk County, farther from the urban core, housing prices are lower, salaries are a little lower, poverty rates a little higher, voted for Donald Trump by almost 10 points. So the fault line of American politics is basically Route 110 down the middle. And even though the typical suburbanite, if there's such a thing, is more moderate than the liberals in the cities and the more conservative people in rural areas, there are a lot of conservatives in the suburbs and there are a lot of liberals in the suburbs. And the key in 40 individual races is to find candidates who will energize the particular voters that they need to get out and try to suppress the vote of those that they don't want to come out. So we're going to be talking about probably 40 individual races, just like presidential cases are individual races in states. And it's going to be a much more complicated effort than national figures and generic balloting would tell you.
So let me follow up on that comment with a question for our panelists, which is that there's been a lot in the media recently made of kind of differences between types of suburbs and the way that, for instance, the Georgia contest between Handel and Ossoff last year, that there's kind of this emerging division between wealthier, more educated suburbs and working class suburbs where people generally have less education, where the former are kind of being pulled into the Democratic Party and the latter are being pulled more towards the Republicans. Is that Is that kind of an enduring realignment? Is that something that you think is going to persist over time, or is that something that's a little bit more transitory, that's temporary, that is associated with kind of Hillary Clinton's persona versus Donald Trump's, for example?
I think it's probably temporary in terms of income stuff. I think what's happening is Trump is such an incredibly polarizing figure, particularly for women, that women suburban voters, I mean, it used to be said of the collar counties in Philadelphia that when the Republican women who are moderate come out and vote, that's the real swing. The men are going to vote for, I don't know what's with this, I'm just going to. The men are going to vote Republican on economic grounds. The women are going to take a look at the candidate and can be driven, and they have been driven out. It's one of the reasons Pennsylvania, despite the middle of Pennsylvania, which votes pretty much like Alabama does, it has been consistently Democratic. When Trump is no longer in the scene, I'm assuming we're going to have a more conventional candidate who's more respectful of women. So the problem that they have is they've now driven 2 generations of Americans away from the Republican Party, and I suspect it's permanent in the case of the millennials, or the so-called millennials. I call them the first globals, because after you've voted for 3 times in a certain way in a presidential election, you tend to vote that way for the rest of your life. There are major turning points, Reagan's election was one of them, where that can be undone, but generally that's the rule. Now they've alienated the generation, I'm not sure if it's called Generation Z. The Parkland kids have a real possibility of, can you fix this? The Parkland kids, that's making it worse. Thanks. The Parkland kids, if this continues, this gun movement continues, they're going to realign Americans on the issue of guns, and it's also going to realign the issue, realign that generation towards Democrats. Assuming the Democrats can get their act together and act like a party that cares about young people and real change as opposed to protecting their traditional sort of constituency groups. But I don't foresee, I do foresee the Republican Party being able to make up some of their losses with older women and suburban women. I don't think they can make up the losses with kids because they've been so incredibly offensive. I mean, Trump, the reason there was grief counseling on all the campuses, including this one after Trump won, is he's basically a negation of every single value that kids have. Anti-climate change, the biggest issue there is. Racist, which you're, you know, it's not like racism is dead in America, but this generation prides itself on liking diversity and having friends that don't look like them. The issues of women, the issues of immigrants, the issues of inclusiveness of Muslim people. These are all core issues for young people in this country. I don't think the millennial generation, which is going to be, I might add, the majority, the largest generation that votes in the next 2 presidential elections, I don't think those kids are ever coming back. But I do think suburban women will come back for economic reasons when the Republicans have a candidate that's not quite as offensive.
I don't know who's going to vote. You know, people always say to me, who's going to win? I said, tell me who's going to vote, and I can probably analyze it pretty good. I find a great turnoff, and I've been around this business for 50 years, probably the greatest turnoff I've seen in my lifetime, and I see it in polls. There's an intensity, obviously, among active Democrats who see an opportunity to go out and cast a protest vote against Trump. The Trump people certainly haven't moved away. Now, whether they're going to turn out in the same kinds of numbers they did, we'll have to wait and see. Most of them got exactly what they expected, a little rougher edge, but it wasn't like, you know, all of a sudden there's this great surprise that he's a womanizer or he's this or he's that. I was telling Howard this morning, a very dear friend of Trump, one of his boyhood friends, is a big, big developer in New York, whose name I won't disclose, said to me, you know, I really liked Obama. I couldn't stand his policies. I really love Trump's policies. I just can't stand Trump. And I think to a certain extent, that's what's holding a lot of Republicans. They like the strength in leadership. But I can tell you, as someone who's been around a long time, I've never seen any political figure or any issue dominate like he has for 2 years. Every single day, There's something new and something different. Most not particularly good, but nevertheless, he's still the dominant factor. You bomb Syria on Friday night, you think you're going to be talking about that all weekend. We're not talking about that. We're talking about Stormy Daniels. We're talking about his lawyer. We're talking about Hannity. It's whoever wants to be that communications job for the next 10 days in the White House has got an impossible job, because here you got Nikki Haley, an outstanding UN ambassador, gets up and says what's the policy of the White House Monday morning, and an hour later it's not the policy of the White House. So Trump is Trump, and whether he wears well or not, my sense among his base, a lot of them are getting what they want. But at the end of the day, I don't know if there's any stability to that. I don't know if you're developing a new generation of leaders. So I think the midterm election is something that there's probably about 50 races that are competitive. The biggest problem Republicans have is they now have 39 incumbents that are not running for re-election. Probably be 40 or 45 by the time there's still 19 states that have registration. And those are always hard seats to hold when you have had incumbents, although the lines are still pretty significant. So I would not be shocked if I woke up the day after the election or the next time we do one of these things next year, and Democrats have a 5 or 10 seat margin, or we have a 3 or 5 seat margin in the House. I think the Senate probably holds just simply because of the numbers. But again, this is a year where there's 25 Democrats up, 10 of whom are in states that Trump carried. We should pick up 10 seats, but we're not going to. But my sense is you could easily end up 6 months from now having exactly the same environment where you've got a 3 or 4 seat margin in the House, either way. You've got a 3 or 4 seat margin in the Senate, either way, and you've got chaos again. And the temptation always will be, if the Democrats do take control, which certainly is a better than 50-50 possibility in the House, are they going to behave and do productive things? Or are they going to try and impeach Trump and destroy themselves? And then they have the Donnybrook next time. They've got the 25 candidates from billionaires to millionaires to socialists to whatever, who are all going to want to be president. And the attitude is, which I hear, Donald Trump can be president, hell, I can be president. And I think to a certain extent that's going to inspire a Donnybrook like we had, and who knows who's going to come through that process. So I would not either bet against Republicans at this point in time. I would not bet against Trump at this point in time. And there's not a one of you in this room, no matter how much you hate Trump or what have you, would basically say, I'm going to bet my backyard, my swimming pool for next summer, that Trump couldn't be reelected. And I think that's, people are going to continue to sort of jockey back and forth. What I really worry about with the young people is there going to be such a turnoff to the political process that, like you say, they vote 3 or 4 times, but if they don't get what they want, if they basically have these movements about gun control, as you know, there's no tougher issue in America to try and change the guns. And for every young person who's out there campaigning, there's 20 guys with guns that will campaign. It's a single issue, probably the most divisive thing in America. And if they don't get their way or they don't get satisfied, what happens? They get turned off to politics, or I hope not. But I just think it's way too soon to try and predict.
Okay, thank you. Ed, I'm going to pick up on what you started with when you said who's going to vote. And the question I would ask now is, what issues will motivate voting? I know these are just the top line results, but I was very surprised. Well, I wasn't surprised to see, of course, that the suburbs were opposed to the state and local tax, the SALT limitations. That we know what the effects are in high tax states like New York, New Jersey, et cetera.
High home ownership. Suburbs have the highest level of home ownership.
Yes.
So it affects people with their mortgages.
Exactly,
yeah.
and so it's not surprising to see the opposition higher in the suburbs than in urban areas. However, and we were discussing this earlier, DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, 80% support in the urban areas, 69% support in the suburbs. Building a border wall, nearly 50% opposition in urban areas, 56%, almost 57% in suburban areas. So, but all of these issues are ones, of course, that the president initiated. The president is not up for election in November 2018. On November 6th. How will these issues matter at the polls, and how will members of Congress be affected by their either endorsement or support for the president's policies or opposition? Larry, I don't know if you want to start with thoughts on that, please.
Individual issues are important in terms of building intensity among specific groups of voters. It helps you target your message. Overall, one issue never seems to drive any one election. Picking up on what I think Ed said, you may have said it as well, Howard. If all the Democrats bring to the table and all they're counting on is the intensity, the ABT vote, anybody but Trump, they're gonna have some problems, because you not only vote against something, you've got to vote for something. And again, in these Tip O'Neill said, to be a sitting cliche here, all politics is local. Well, nothing's more local than a congressional election. And if you try to nationalize races with in places that are more conservative than the Democratic norm, by running candidates who are more progressive than the district as a whole, you may have a problem there.
Okay, thank you. Howard, comments on, will immigration or taxes be important for members of Congress who are up for election, or who are running on November 6th?
I have some disagreements with Larry about the need for a positive message. I hate to be cynical about it, but the truth is, when you're in a presidential year, you absolutely have to have a positive message. You're not going to get elected president of the United States saying why the other guy is awful. But in the off year, it's incredibly effective to run as "we're not Trump," and just ask Barack Obama, who lost 63 seats in 2010. And lost more, again, seats in 2014. And basically the Republicans just ran an incredibly negative campaign, and I suspect you'll see a fair amount of that. So I'm not sure. Now, individual candidates have to have, it just can't be just talking about how awful Trump is. That is true. But the overall message of the Democratic Party, we don't even I actually encourage people not to use this message, because there isn't anybody who doesn't have an opinion about Donald Trump in this country. I mean, he loves that. That's what he does. He's a reality star, and his idea is, if you're talking about me, that's great, no matter what you say. So we don't have to go out and say terrible things about Trump, because people are, as this poll shows, unbelievably polarized about Trump. But the idea that we all have to have a positive message and say how we're going to change everything, that's not, I don't think that's necessarily as true as it might be in an off-year election.
The frustration the public has shown up in the congressional numbers. The Congress has the lowest approval ratings of anybody in modern times. Nancy Pelosi, who's been around the scene for a long time, has a 21% approval rating, which sounds terrible until you think that Paul Ryan has a 24% approval rating, and Mitch McConnell is somewhere in that same range. Those are unbelievable numbers for leaders. The issues that you lay out here, the issues that are talked about in here, this Congress is going to do nothing more. They've done it. They're done. Something that's very popular that people want to have done is the infrastructure program. They can't get that thing done. Paul Ryan says, my last final thing is I'm going to get a DACA through. That's not going to happen. We need a comprehensive immigration bill, which DACA is one part of it, but you're certainly not going to see in the months before a midterm election in which you've got 40 or 50, or I ran the congressional committee, so I can promise you there may be 40 or 50 real races. There's 100 who think they're in real races, and another 120 who are petrified because they have an opponent, even though they got 70% of the vote last time. So they're going to do nothing. I mean, I just tell you that. They're going to do nothing. And they're certainly not going to do anything on gun control. They're certainly not going to do anything on state and local taxes. I mean, they might as well all go home and start campaigning right now, because I just don't see anything happening in the Congress. So the frustration of the public, again, is going to be, this is a do-nothing Congress. Is that good enough to change the dynamics? We'll see. If both sides will argue it's a do-nothing Congress and it's the other person's fault. The House yells that it's the Senate's fault, we passed all these bills. The Senate says it's those idiotic bills the House is passing. And the reality is the biggest debate that will go on in the remaining months before this campaign are going to be on the Trump appointments. You got a Secretary of State who's now been nominated but may not make it through the Foreign Affairs Committee. You certainly have a CIA director that's going to have a knockdown, drag-out fight. I know many of the ambassadors have not been appointed. Trump's appointed very, very few people in the personnel area. And I have a very dear friend who's been a long-time Republican New Yorker who's going to be an ambassador if she gets confirmed. But she was told by the majority leader in the Senate, if one Democrat objects, because that in turn means there's 30 hours of debate on the floor, we just have to drop you. We're not going to pick you up, no matter how much I love you and how much important you've been to the party. So if you've got 60 or 70 nominees, and it becomes a strategy to let's stop the judges, let's stop the ambassadors, you're going to have chaos for the next several months. And whether does that turn people off, turn people on, I can't predict it at this point in time.
Okay. I think we can probably do a couple more questions here, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Chris, did you?
Sure. So I had a question. I think, Howard, you had mentioned the Virginia contest. And at the center, one thing that we found in prior waves of the poll is that there's a significant split between white suburbanites and suburbanites of color, those living in majority minority suburbs. And that, at least from what I read in the media, kind of was one factor in Northam's win in Virginia, that he did do some outreach to minority suburbanites. Do you think that the diversifying suburbs, the fact that suburbs are becoming less homogenous, is kind of on the radar of the parties, and are they adjusting their strategies accordingly?
In the Virginia race, the parties were supporters, but they didn't initiate it. It was Run for Something and Indivisible and all these internet groups that are, The Color of Change is another one. The Collective PAC, which is a PAC that specializes in African-American candidates who are always underfunded. And so the strategy is not a democratic strategy. It's coming from the grassroots up. I think real change comes from the grassroots up. I don't think it comes from the top down. And so I think the parties are more isolated than they've ever been before. I think people see the Republican Party splitting, and it's always in the paper, and that's obvious. There's a big difference between Trump and Bob Dole or somebody like that. I think what they don't see is on the Democratic side, we're remaking ourselves in the capitalist process of creative destruction. Luckily, ours is not full of angry feelings. There's some from the Sanders people, but that's a really small minority. Not the Sanders people are not a small minority, but the ones that are still complaining and carrying on are a small minority. So there is this huge determination among young people to make a difference. I just realized when I talked about the suburban vote, I consider Northam's to be really incredible. Here's the interesting stat on Northam. Northam is what I call a boring centrist. He's a really good guy. He's a pediatrician, the best kind of doctor there is, and I'm not one, so I can say nice things without feathering my own. But he is really a centrist Democrat in a pretty centrist state. He got 69% of the under 30-year-old vote. 69%. You don't see numbers like that. And so they are making a statement about a direction they want to go in. The other thing is, 11 out of the 15 new candidates who are all mostly young and rainbow color and all this are women. That's the core of the Democratic Party, is women, and particularly black women. And they're now serving in office. We haven't seen that before. We've seen, oh yes, you're a part of our base, isn't that great? Well now, the core here of any party to be successful is you have to have people who are running for office and winning who look like the party that you are claiming to be. Well, that happened in the Virginia election. So yes, the suburbs are becoming more colorful, and that makes a big difference, and more diverse, and that makes an enormous difference because the suburbs continue, in general, the close-in suburbs continue to be wealthy. There are a lot of entrepreneurs. There are a ton of immigrants from countries which we would classify here as people of color, and they are united. When I first got into the national scene running the DNC, We would take a lot of the minority vote, but we wouldn't get Asian Americans for the most part because they come and they tend to start their own businesses and they vote suburban Republican. We only failed to get a single group last year, and it was Vietnamese Americans, because the boat people still feel about the Democratic Party the way the older Cubans did. We got Cuban Americans, we got every single hyphenated group in the country except for Vietnamese Americans.
And white voters.
And white voters, which are not a hyphenated group. Yes, the nature of the suburbs is changing. They're still prosperous, but they are becoming more colorful, and for the time being, that helps us a lot.
I'm going to ask,
Yeah.
Larry.
No, go ahead.
I just want to ask one last policy question, then maybe we can open it up, because Professor Burnett, when he was discussing these very surprising survey results that I know we'll continue to discuss, I think, Craig, you said that the DACA numbers suggest that there's some room for movement on this issue, that at least when you see some 80% of people polled in urban areas supporting some sort of action for childhood arrivals, close to 70% in the suburbs, and actually in rural areas, 63%. These are high numbers, right? This is close to a supermajority. But then, Ed, I'm taken with your comment that very persuasively, this is a do-nothing Congress, that if appointments and judicial confirmations aren't getting done, how will legislation on infrastructure or immigration get done? So I guess my question is, what opportunity is there in the 7 months between now and the elections? Is there a possible short-term fix? Or is this?
If Democrats are willing to give Trump his wall, which they're not, he's willing to give them their DACA. He's not going to give them their DACA without the wall. So I would say both are not saleable. And I would equally argue at this point in time, I think doing DACA alone, and I'm a big supporter of DACA, I'm a big supporter of immigration reform, I'm one of the few Republicans that are. I think doing DACA alone basically locks out, you've created a second class, and we still have millions and millions and millions of people living in this country that are not legal, and there's no path to leadership. What I'd hate to have happen is DACA get taken care of, and then basically the rest of it. We need a comprehensive bill, and I remind people again and again, when President Obama had majorities in both houses of Congress, he wanted immigration reform and couldn't get it done. When George W. Bush had both houses of Congress, he wanted to do immigration reform, couldn't get it done. It's still a very, very difficult issue. It's nice to show up on the polls that people are supportive of it, but I haven't seen it shown up in the Congress yet. And I think to a certain extent, when you get down to the details, that's when it gets difficult.
Okay, thank you.
And it's certainly not going to happen in the next 3 or 4 months. I just.
The biggest challenge for both parties, and I'm looking forward when we do the drill down or onion peeling or whatever, is not just rallying their own bases, that's obviously job number one, but it's reaching out to independents. And in suburban communities, there tend to be a greater number of people who are either see themselves as nonpartisan, even if they're members of a party, or are not a member of a party. On Long Island, for instance, the fastest growing numbers in voter registration are what we call blanks, independents, not the Independence Party, but independents. So the question is, how do these issues, as they're showing up, play in terms of reaching beyond each base to, the base from the city to the suburbs, from rural areas to the suburbs? Because the party that successfully builds that bridge from their base is going to win.
Well, as we know, plurality of Americans identify themselves as independent voters. They're not really independent voters. 9 out of 10 times they vote Democrat or they vote Republican. So you have about 10% of the electorate, and I do admit that it's a rising number and will be more of a rising number as there's more of the polarization, that are the swing voters. And they basically are the ones that decide elections. If Republicans get 53%, 54% of the swing voters, that's the margin, that's the 2 or 3% margin. And that's the battleground, that's where it is. And and I think as time goes on and there's more polarization, you're going to see more and more people say, I'm not really a Democrat, I'm not really a Republican, I'm really an independent, but then they come back and the pattern is, well, okay, well, who do you vote for president? Who do you vote for Congress? And usually pretty much it's predictable. There's two elements today that decide, and I've lived with a lot of polls over the years, and I'm an advocate of polling. Polling is like, if you don't have polling, it's like flying an airplane without instruments. You may be able to do it, but you don't do it very well. The reality is today, it used to be economic, it used to be education, it used to be a whole variety of things. The two most relevant issues today, what is your party registration? If you say you're a Democrat, you're going to vote Democrat. If you say you're a Republican, 90% are going to vote Republican. If you say you go to church on Sunday, you're an evangelical, or any other element that goes to church on Sunday, you're more inclined to be a Republican. If you never go to church, you're more inclined to be a Democrat. And those are patterns that basically are pretty relevant. And the late Roger Ailes, when he was running Fox News, would basically say, when his polling people came in, he'd say, ask the question, not who you're going to vote for president, who you're going to vote for Congress. Are you a Republican? Do you vote for a Republican congressman? And name it. Name your congressman. And you pretty much get a pattern there of more accuracy. The problem with polling today is the combination of the online, everybody struggles with the polling, as you guys know better than anybody. It's not a simple factor anymore. When I started in polling or started in politics, I used to knock on the door and talk to people and do a survey, and those are very accurate. Then you've got the telephones, and those are very accurate. Today, you've got combinations of online, and you work all kinds of formulas to try and justify and work out the differences. But it's very, very difficult to get people, and I'm sure this poll, and we see all the data on it, been very. Again, when I tell people about polling, it shows you a pattern. If I just spend $20 million on ads and I've lost 5 points, then I know my ads didn't work. It's about momentum, and you sort of measure one against the other. If you like CBS poll, measure CBS against CBS. We now have Real Clear Politics, 538, and they take a multiple of polls and they put them in there together, and you get it's a pretty good idea, but it's not perfectly accurate.
Thank you, Ed. We have about 20 minutes for questions, and we've raised a number of topics about polling, policy issues, party demographics, and the congressional elections. Why don't we have microphones on either side. We'd like to get some students to speak up if they would. So if we can start with a couple of student questions, and we'll see if we can expand. Students are all being very shy. Oh, here comes a student.
Hi, it's been a pleasure listening to you guys today. My name's Brooke. I'm an international business student here at Hofstra University. Can you hear me okay? Is this good? Okay.
You
so
speak
I
just
had
a little bit louder.
Okay,
Pull the mic down a little bit.
there you go.
That's
There we
it.
go. Okay, good.
There you go.
So I was just thinking, we're talking about Generation Z, millennials, these kids who have been involved in these school shootings. Most of them will start to be 18 by the time the 2020 election comes around. So how crucial do you think the future candidates' positions on gun control are in regards to getting them elected?
I think the young people are going to be a factor. I mean, the people who watch polls more closely than anybody else are candidates and incumbents. And so if all of a sudden there's a movement, I mean, right today there's a very significant factor, and the single issues are things like abortion, guns, a few other things, environment, that really drive voters. And the gun guys, basically, they vote on that issue. They don't care what else you are. And so is that going to be offset by young people who decide this is the most important issue for me? Maybe today is it the most important issue? It's just a very difficult, as you can see, every time we have one of these shootings that are terrible, terrible tragedies in this country, everybody says, well, we got to do something about it, and yet nothing ever happens. We still haven't put the gun block in on that was after the Las Vegas shooting. So I think it depends on how active the young people are, how much of a factor they're going to become in the voting. Certainly, I would argue if that's an issue that you really care about, then make it your front and center issue.
So the polling on gun issues has been not where the NRA is for a long time. Certainly since the massacre in Connecticut, Newtown. But before that even, people wanted more than the NRA was willing to give. And the NRA, I think, has moved further and further to the extreme as well.
They're giving nothing.
However, it doesn't, the polls on the issues are not what matters. What matters is you're going to have to kick some people out of office. That's when they're going to take notice. We've already seen 20 years of polls where the American people are in one place on guns, and the NRA continues to scare the hell out of the politicians with their money and their ads and single-issue intense voters. We have a fascinating situation coming up in Vermont where the Republican governors just signed a pretty modest gun control bill, but it was real, and the NRA hates it, and there's a lot of protests. He went right to it at his base and took them on. Now, if he wins re-election, there's going to be a message sent to the NRA about their loss of ability to terrify politicians. But if he doesn't win, or if some of these congressmen who are not with the Parkland kids don't get kicked out, then you're not going to get anywhere. So I think the message has got to be, if you want something, you got to vote, and you got to get huge numbers out and vote on your direction. I think it could happen. I think Rick Scott, who's a very good politician, I don't have a lot of use for him, but he is a good politician, running against Bill Nelson is a really interesting race. And I think it just got harder for Rick Scott. But if Rick Scott wins, then that's going to be not a good thing for people who want to use gun control. So kids are going to have to get out and vote and make sure he doesn't win. And that's the message that drives it. As soon as that happens, the power of the NRA is broken. But until it happens, it's very much intact no matter what the polls say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I see we have 5 more questioners. We're going to try to get everyone in if we can. So let's see if we can do the questions, direct them to whom you're asking. And why don't we go 1, 2, and then we'll go do the next 3. Okay, go ahead.
First of all, I just want to say thank you guys for coming down, and thank you, Edward, for coming back down again. I remember you from the last panel. You gave me a terrific answer to my question, and I really like the subject of your topics. So I started with international affairs as my minor, and it brought me into the field of politics, and since then it's been a passion of mine to explore different fields of it and come up with theories of my own. And one of them that I've come up with that I think is probably one of my more controversial, which I wanted your opinion on since you've been one of the longest standing members within politics here at this panel, is currently we see a bipolarity in America between Republicans and Democrats, and it's forcing more and more of a polarization between the common people either leaning towards a Republican or Democrat, and it's causing a massive schism within beliefs and how we operate and how we think America should be run. And certain states, it's coming to physical blows. My theory is, and this is where it gets really controversial, is I think it's going to come to a point where the Republican and Democratic system can no longer sustain itself, where the differences will become too wide and people will become too far into their own beliefs to ever meet some sort of middle ground, and America won't be able to make any sort of progress. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are that we've had 2 parties since 1856. Republican Party got started in 1856, and Lincoln in 1860. And for whatever reason, those 2 parties have been the dominant entities. At Bull Moose a little bit with Teddy Roosevelt, but predominantly 2 parties. I'm not sure 2 parties alone. The only problem with trying to go beyond that is the political system we live in. The organizations that control these elements in states like this state make it very difficult for independents, as Bernie Sanders found out, and Jack Kemp and Ross Perot and others who have run as independents. Michael Bloomberg came to me a number of times and he kept saying, I want to run for president, I've got $2 billion, can I win? And each time I'd go back and say, no, you can't win. You can't get to 270 electoral votes. And if you did get 270 electoral votes, which everybody in New York says Mike Bloomberg would be the perfect president, what do you do with the Congress? And the Congress, again, is split between 2. I mean, there's a handful of people who declare themselves as independents. I do think we need more. I don't think we ought to be driven by the ideology of the two parties that are getting further and further apart. There's no effort now to come to the center. There used to be centrists. Democrats used to have Southern Democrats who were conservatives and Northern Democrats who were more liberal. Republicans used to have Northeast liberals and kind of a conservative base out of the West Coast. Today, that's all kind of merged. There is no moderate Republicans left. There is no conservative Democrats. I mean, what you might define as a conservative is not what would be defined as a conservative. That narrows the focus. There's a big range in between of where people's ideas are, but there is no place to vote. And so going back to the point about being independent, you end up with a pattern where you vote 9 out of 10 times for Democrat or Republican. I think if, we're not in a parliamentary system, so we can't do what Europe does, but I do think as time goes on, there will be young people, and these powers of the internet and what have you are going to basically change American politics to where people that are like-minded will find candidates they like and support financially and economically, and it'll change. It may be 10 years, it may be 20 years, but we have a system today that doesn't work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Liz?
Hi, I'm Jaylani. I'm a public policy student.
Closer to the mic.
Is this good?
Yeah.
Turn it up.
So my question kind of goes back to the point that you made about how black women have always been the base of the Democratic Party, but now we're seeing a lot of black women running for office. And then, of course, we have women like Maxine Waters, who's just been out here even since like the LA riots and stuff like that, making the black community visible. And so I guess my question is just that obviously like embracing people of color is going to be really important for the Democratic Party. And it's also going to be really important for them to not fall into this white working class rhetoric and this like what about the white people rhetoric, because if you look at Congress and who's involved in politics, white people are and have always been represented. So I was just wondering if you as a Democrat have any ideas of how the Democratic Party can go about embracing people of color without tokenizing people of color.
Well, I think, again, the races in Virginia were really interesting. And this is not going to come from the top of the Democratic Party. People tend to stay where they are and not want change. I mean, we all talk about how much change we want, but when you get in the position of power, you don't have to be a racist to decide that maybe you should stay there. And that's sort of the problem. So what I see happening is this sort of message from the bottom up saying, look, everybody has to be included. And I actually think Obama is a game changer. I think in the African American community, people are much less willing to put up with stuff that they might have put up with before Barack Obama became president of the United States. There's no reason to do that. And the message from the black community, the Democrats, is, okay, we've been helping you for a long time with huge turnouts and huge percentages of participation. Now, we're done if you can't do better than you've been doing. And again, what I said about guns, the most important way to influence the behavior of politicians is at the ballot box. So there need to be, and there's an incredible successful primary in Illinois where an young African-American woman was supported by all the internet groups. She won. Now she's got a race that's quite close against an incumbent Republican. That's a winnable race. And I am sure the African American community is going to look very carefully at how much support she gets from the party, and if she doesn't, there's going to be a lot of trouble inside the party, as there should be. So I think the bar has been raised in the expectations of the black community. It's not enough to have Maxine Waters, who represents if not a majority black district, a pretty big. Now we're going to see, Barack Obama has proved that you do not have to be a person who just represents people who look like you, that you can represent the whole country. Now we got to make that stick. Even though presidency is the biggest race there is, we still have to make sure that people understand that. And there's going to be resistance. All resistance is racist in a sense, but it's by people who aren't aware that they're racist. And that's the struggle inside the Democratic Party. You don't have overt racism, but you have all kinds of other aspects of racism that exist, and that has to be overcome. And I think the younger generation is much more likely to successfully overcome it than the older generation.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you, Jelani. Let's see if we have 9 minutes. Let's see if we can do all 3 questions quickly. Go ahead.
Well, just to feed on your last point, also the Ray Moore election, black women, black and in a tremendous majority, really were responsible for the Democratic victory in that race. But I have a question for Mr. Rollins. I don't usually watch Fox News, but I saw you on Fox News. And I think the discussion was about the warrants, the FISA warrants, and whether the Justice Department was biased. And you made the statement that you thought 9,000 to 10,000 of the lawyers in the Justice Department were liberal Democrats. So I'd like to know the source of your material.
And that doesn't mean because they're Democrat that they're bad people. But I think the reality is any polling that's ever been done, employees in the federal government, the Justice Department, or what have you, it's a natural place. The interesting thing about justice is it gets some extraordinary young lawyers, come out of law schools, good law schools, don't want to go to work for firms, and basically go to work in the Justice Department. What I was arguing was I was defending the fact that Mueller has put together a team that they're saying is all Clinton supporters. And what I would argue, having sat on the judicial selection panel for judges and U.S. attorneys and U.S. marshals, is there's a political system out there, both Republican and Democrat, and if you want to become a U.S. attorney, if you want to become a judge, if you want to become a U.S. marshal, you get in one camp or the other camp. And if you wanted to come out of Nassau County and be a judge, you got to be in the political system. I just think that there's no empirical data that basically says that 90% are, but whenever you've seen any estimates of government employees in Washington, D.C. versus the country, that's pretty much the numbers.
Aren't you then?
I'm sorry, we're going to have to move on. But thank you.
I mean, there's no way I can prove it. It's what I think is right, so.
Hi, thank you guys for being here today. I always enjoy your panels. My question revolves around the fact that several studies that I've read since the 2016 election, including an article in the New York Times just as recently as the other day, was talking about, despite issues like the gun control reform being led by Generation Z, that growing up in a post-9/11 world where the emphasis has been on a lot of security, that Generation Z is going to tend to lean conservative when they're all old enough to vote. Just a general question for all you guys. What's your opinion on this matter?
Probably have one person. Larry, would you like to respond to that one?
I'm a little clogged up.
Generation Z leans conservative, may lean conservative because of the factor of 9/11 being in their lifetime. Would that make them more conservative about national defense and other issues?
I don't think so. I think that 9/11 felt so personally that it's something that individuals, have internalized and made part of the way they vote, the way they live. It's certainly been a problem for some groups. Muslims have borne the brunt of a backlash, in my opinion, unfairly, after 9/11. It is a very New York thing. When you saw how hard it was to get the Bedroga Act, in other words, medical care through Congress for the victims, there were people all over members of Congress all over the country who seemed to have forgotten, and it certainly didn't resonate and doesn't resonate in their communities. So I don't think so. I mean, it's just what I think, as Ed said to the other person, but I don't think so.
It's a good topic for further discussion.
But there is an evolution that takes place. He was a Republican when he was your age. I was Democrat when I was your age. There's an evolution that happens, and
Some people get smart and some don't. What are you going to do?
Okay.
Some people get rich, and some people get poor. So.
I don't think either of you guys are getting poor.
Thank you. If you have a 30-second question and direct it to a person, we'll squeeze it in.
Quick question. Thank you for the panel. I really enjoyed the questions from Mr. Dean. As you know, there's been a lot of discussion about the use of Facebook and other big data in the news. And the question is, President Obama used and put together a very sophisticated a group of people who used this data in his 08 and 12 elections. My question to you is what happened to this group? Hillary seemed to eschew this type of organization. The second question is what's your view of using this data to help Democrats or Republicans win?
Well, what Obama did was very different than what was done by
No
the
doubt.
Russians and by Cambridge Analytica, and even Facebook. It's absolutely fascinating. Facebook is being sold off today on Wall Street because people are betting that the other tech companies will do better. I don't think they will. I think I've long anticipated this for the 4 or 5 really enormous tech giants. They all have monopolies. Their sophistication is far beyond the understanding of the vast majority of young people who use them. There's some argument that the young people don't care about their privacy nearly as much as we do, and I think there's some truth to that. I suspect you're going to see a huge amount of regulation in the next 10 or 15 years of these giant tech companies, and I wouldn't be terribly surprised if some of them were broken up. What Facebook did is to me, is not surprising, but it's shocking from a moral point of view. They knew what they were doing. They sold people's data. They gave people's data away. And, they were used by the Russians, and I don't think that they had some special deal with the Russians, but they allowed all kinds of privacy that was well beyond what they stated they were going to do. So I think there is going to be a backlash. I think it's a problem for the United States and for other countries as well. The Europeans are interestingly far enough ahead of this, and I used to sort of think, well, wait a minute, leave our companies alone. But the truth is, this happens, although the tech is unusual and is new and it's cutting edge and people my age don't really fully understand it, the same thing happened with the oil companies and the railroads and so forth. When companies get so big that they actually threaten the sovereignty of nations, eventually somebody does something about it, and I think that's what's happened. So I think stay tuned, but I think in the next 10 or 15 years, you're going to see this is going to happen in Google, it's going to happen in Amazon. Notwithstanding the president's fit of pique, I don't think that's going to do much good, but I do think eventually somebody's going to have to confront the fact that Amazon essentially is a huge monopoly as well. And it's just going to be the way it is. If you want real competition and you want the kind of freedom that these young people want, you can't have monopolies passing out the freedom. It's really like you have 4 Chinese governments overseeing things in Silicon Valley, and I don't think that's a situation that's going to last over a long period of time. And I think you're now, as a result of what's just been discovered that Facebook has done, you're going to now see an erosion of freedom among these companies to do whatever they want because they're in a monopoly position.
Well,
Thank
not
you,
just
sir.
a monopoly. The bottom line is they use data without asking permission. If they basically ask you to check a box saying your data can be used by, I'm going to sell it to X, Y, and Z or a political campaign, and certainly if you're going to do it a political campaign, you have to give both sides equal access. I think there's going to be big regulation. I think clearly people are going to come in and argue the privacy issue. They can't control NASA, they can't control these elements, but they certainly can control Facebook, and they will do that.
Thank you very
Subject
much,
for
sir.
further discussion. Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists, Professor Burnett, for a very informative discussion.